Hello, friends, and welcome to the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast. These episodes have been remastered for better sound quality by Rob at Wrong Way Recording. When you need it done right, you choose Wrong Way. WrongWayRecording.com. Initially imagined by me as a 10-part series, the Diabetes Pro Tip series has grown to 26 episodes. These episodes now exist in your audio player between episode 1000 and episode 1025. They are also available online at diabetesprotip.com and juiceboxpodcast.com. This series features myself and Jennifer Smith. Jenny is a CDE and a type 1 for over 35 years. This series was my attempt to bring together the management ideas found within the podcast in a way that would make it digestible and revisitable. It has been so incredibly popular that these 26 episodes are responsible for well over 500,000 downloads within the Juicebox Podcast. While you're listening, please remember that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. This episode of the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen blood glucose meter. And they have an amazing offer for you. Right now, at my link only, contournext.com/juicebox free meter, you can get an absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit. That's contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by Touched by Type 1. See all of the good work they're doing for people living with type 1 diabetes at touchedbytype1.org and on their Instagram and Facebook pages. This show is sponsored today by the glucagon that my daughter carries, Gvoke HypoPen. Find out more at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. A half an hour before you and I started recording this, someone sent me a message on Instagram and said, how do I deal with fat and protein overnight? Because I was bolusing all night with my kid. So I texted them back and I said, hey, great timing. Can you see my recording calendar from where you're at? And hold tight because the answer is coming. This is another one that Jenny proposed that I'm really interested in, and I don't know how much help I'm going to be. Why don't we start with what I know? Because it's so little.
Awesome.
So for everyone who listens to the podcast and knows that I'm just sort of fluid with insulin, right? Like more need equals more insulin. And so because of that, I don't usually stop and think about whether that means it's protein or fat or what it is. Just if Arden's blood sugar seems to require insulin, I give it more. I'm assuming I've been handling fat and protein rises forever.
You're not dissecting her meals. You're just saying, I see the need. I'm giving more insulin. That's kind of what you do.
Yeah. I see diabetes as a forest fire, and I fly over it with a giant plane full of water and just drop all the water on top of it. Then I go, oh, look, we got most of it. And
look at that's where the fire started.
Yeah, there it is.
The fireman comes in and looks at, and Scott's like, I didn't really care where it started. I just want to take care of it.
Meaningless to me. I'll go get another plane full of insulin and drop it back on again. So, so I never really think about stuff like that. I do a little more, obviously, as you and I have been speaking as the years go past. But I find it to be, it's another level. Like sometimes I joke about things being like ninja level. Like I think that you don't really need to know about fat and protein if you're doing what I do. But you do need to know if you want to start understanding things in a bigger way. So I'm really excited to do this. Now, the only thing I know about protein is that I do indiscriminately bolus for protein. I don't know why I do it, but I do it. So where some people might look at a plate and go, oh, there's potatoes. Well, that's, this many carbs. But then there's a cheeseburger. Well, that's meat. I don't do that. And here's a roll. The roll's 25 carbs. And, and we're going to have broccoli. And I don't know, broccoli probably has 5 or 6 carbs in it. Like, so I look at a plate.
Good job.
I look at a plate. I go, broccoli, 6. The roll, let's call it 30. Then I look at the potatoes and I go, I don't know, 35. And then I look at the burger and I go, let's call it 10. And we'll extend it for a little bit. And so that's me looking at a cheeseburger with mashed potatoes and broccoli, right? I don't know why I do that with the burger, other than I know people who eat incredibly low carb who tell me that they bolus for their protein, but farther out from when they actually ingest it. Is any of that right? If visiting Dancing for Diabetes is wrong, I don't want to be right. Not about this. I want to be right about the fat and protein thing, but I would not want to be right about visiting Dancing for Diabetes being wrong if it was wrong, which it's not. I think you should definitely do it. Dancing4diabetes.com. You know, studies show that if ads are incredibly confusing, they work so much better. Check out Dancing for Diabetes on Instagram and Facebook. Throw them a like. It's a really great organization. Dancing4diabetes.com. Even if you're not interested, could you go like their pages because they paid for this and now I'm listening back to it and I didn't do a very good job. So let's at least give them their money's worth. Is any of that right? Because I don't.
Yes.
Is it?
So again, from the standpoint of looking, you're not doing this in a blind way. You have the method that you've developed for analyzing, looking at Arden's control and her management and what happens here and what happens there. And you remember it. You've got like this like library of like times of this has happened. You can like pick from them, Scott. And you're like, I know this happened last time. So this time for the burger and broccoli, we're going to give 10 for the burger because I know what happened last time and something was off and the carb count for everything else was right. In context though, for everybody who's listening and why would you need to bolus for protein? It's really typically 2 points that you'd need to bolus for protein. One, you brought up the low carb eaters or those who are eating lower carb at times. If you've got a meal that's typically less than about 15 to 20 grams of carb, and a normal amount of protein, not like this big 16-ounce steak, but a typical, 5-ounce chicken, 4 or 5-ounce chicken breast, let's say. You're usually going to need about 40, 50, sometimes even 60% of the amount of protein in the aftermath of that meal in order to accommodate for your body's own digestion of protein in a low carb environment. Because remember, carb is the body's natural first fuel, right?
Okay.
If there's not enough of that first fuel there, your body looks to another source like protein, digests it down, and you get a usable amount of glucose out of protein, even if it's not a huge amount of protein eaten in a lower carb environment. The opposite of that would be, let's say, she has a high carb meal, or anybody has a high carb meal that's like the meat lover's pizza, okay? And which is not only a huge amount of carb as well as a huge amount of fat, but you've got this large amount of protein. Let's say instead of your standard like 25 gram portion of protein, which is like about the size of the palm of a woman's hand. That's about 20 to 25 grams of protein. That's pretty normal amount. Okay. If you've got this huge amount of protein that you're taking in, even in a normal amount of carb or a high amount of carb, you're still going to need bolus for about, let's say 50% of that protein, but it's going to be a drawn out type of insulin need. So both of those scenarios would require you to you're doing like a dual bolus. You're extending some of it, assuming you're meeting that protein kind of need for a while. Protein bolus typically is a good idea is at the end of the meal to set an extended bolus with 0% delivered upfront and 100% extended out over about a 3-hour time period. Okay. And that's just for where proteins impact. Usually starts impacting about 2-ish hours after a meal. And then by about 3 hours, you're too high and you might sit high and correct to try to get it back down. When in effect, had you used what you used to correct to actually bolus for the protein, you wouldn't have had the rise to correct to begin with.
Yeah, I got it. It's parallel to the idea of over bolusing, like when you can't pre-bolus and you throw in a ton extra to handle the rise before the rise happens. Okay. So I bolus the meal normally, then I finish eating and I put in this amount for the protein in an extended bolus, 0% up front, the rest of it out over maybe 3 hours.
Correct. Correct.
So basically, I'm creating a heavier blanket of insulin over the time frame where the food's going to have impact.
Where the protein's going to have the impact, or where you're assuming from previous experience with meals like that, that impact is going to kind of fall in. And fat is even longer.
Right.
Yeah, as we've kind of talked about before, fat can have impact up to 10 to 12 hours after eating high fat.
How does that technically happen? So these are where my questions exist. And by the way, everyone listening, I just stared at Jenny while she said that and thought, "Ooh, I'm in a master's class about diabetes." and so fat, as an example, does it slow down digestion? Like, why does fat hold up blood sugar? I don't understand, I guess. The Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series is sponsored by Ascensia Diabetes, makers of the Contour Next Gen Blood Glucose Meter, and they have a unique offer just for listeners of the Juicebox Podcast. If you're new to Contour, you can get a free Contour Next Gen starter kit by visiting this special link, contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. When you use my link, you're going to get the same accurate meter that my daughter carries. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. Head there right now and get yourself the starter kit. This free kit includes the Contour Next Gen meter, 10 test strips, 10 lancets, a lancing device, control solution, and a carry case. But most importantly, it includes an incredibly accurate and easy to use blood glucose meter. This Contour meter has a bright light for nighttime viewing, an easy to read screen. It fits well in your hand and features second chance sampling, which can help you to avoid wasting strips. Every one of you has a blood glucose meter. You deserve an accurate one. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter to get your absolutely free Contour Next Gen starter kit sent right to your door. When it's time to get more strips, you can use my link and save time and money buying your Contour Next products from the convenience of your home. It's completely possible that you will pay less out of pocket in cash for your Contour strips than you're paying now through your insurance. contournext.com/juiceboxfreemeter. Go get yourself a free starter kit. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. Touched by Type 1 has a wide array of resources and programs for people living with Type 1 diabetes. When you visit touchedbytype1.org, go up to the top of the page where it says Programs. There you're going to see all of the terrific things that Touched by Type 1 is doing. And I mean, it's a lot. Type 1 at school, the D-Box program, Golfing for Diabetes, Dancing for Diabetes, which is a terrific program. You just click on that to check that out. Bowl for a Cause, their awareness campaigns, and the annual conference that I've spoken at a number of years in a row. It's just amazing, just like Touched by Type 1. Touchedbytype1.org, or find them on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the show notes. Links at juiceboxpodcast.com to Touched by Type 1 and the other great sponsors that are supporting the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Touchedbytype1.org.
Yeah, so one, it's also usually the reason, as you just said, fat does slow digestion a bit. It's a tough nutrient for your body to break down and make use of. Mm-hmm. So even if there's a ton of carb with it, it's often the reason that somebody eats a pizza and they're like, wow, I must have nailed that carb count because my blood sugar is like beautiful, rock steady, flat, no rise at all. And then all of a sudden later, they get this like creep. And the creep happens and it happens and then you ride high and you're like throwing insulin at it and dumping the plane worth of insulin on it. You're like, what's the problem here? You know, it's annoying, right? Especially for people who may not realize where it's coming from because they've never been told what it potentially could be. So it's not a missed amount of carb, but it is the reason that you had that nice flat look in the aftermath of eating that, let's call it pizza. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, if you just ate the pizza crust, I guarantee that pizza crust is going to give you a rise without the fat being there, right?
Like,
even if you did bolus.
Bread. Right. Yeah.
Right, bread or potatoes or whatever it is. Now, fat, the other reason it impacts blood sugar is because as it gets into the system, it creates a rise in triglycerides in the bloodstream, which is a stress on the system. So we know what stress does to blood sugar, right?
Okay.
But as a stressor, it impacts insulin use as if it's reducing it by about 50%. So let's say your basal overnight is running at 1.0 units an hour, and it works beautiful. You've tested it, you know that it does what it's supposed to do, but in the effect of pizza or anything high fat, nachos and cheese or whatever the whole bucket of chocolate, whatever it is,
Right.
you essentially have a basal now that's functioning almost at like 0.5 instead of 1. And so you are not getting the impact of all the basal you need. Your blood sugar climbs because of the fat, and it stays high because of the fat. And it can be long duration. So, I mean, we typically recommend people accommodate for a high fat meal or something, high fat in nature, like the whole Haagen-Dazs Sundae bar or whatever. 50% increase in basal at the end of the meal.
Okay.
And you extend it out over 8 hours.
Wow. A 50% basal increase over 8 hours for a ton of fat. See, that's
for a ton of fat.
That's where, so Jenny, so there's a couple things in there, but the one thing she just said was how the impact of the food sort of gives the appearance that your basal's only at half power because now your body needs so much more insulin. It's funny because that's stuff I've been saying for years, but I never thought of it that way, right? I never considered it the way you just said it. I always say the body, in high carb situations, you need more basal. That just makes sense. If 1 unit keeps you stable when you're not putting the body through the paces, then when you're attacking it with ice cream or pizza or something like that, it stands to reason that you would need more in that situation to meet the need. But it's interesting the way you put it. I hope that maybe that'll strike other people maybe at the core of their thinking, because that's a neat idea. Like when you're using that kind of food, it's as if you don't have enough basal by half.
Correct.
So they have something to measure with. Even the idea of 8 hours. I think the genius behind the extended, the temp basal increase over that much time is that if you do start to trend down at some point, you can just make the decision, hey, the food's out of my system now. I can shut it off. Maybe I'll have to recorrect this a tiny bit but that's it.
Right. And or maybe you got enough temping increase for quite a while, and now it's going to navigate down as you turn it off. And you may not necessarily get 100% back to target, but you're certainly going to navigate down to a much lower number than you would have been had you not done that at all.
Yeah. I mean, and you have to know by now, if you've been listening this long, that you would rather stop a low or falling blood sugar than fight with a high one. That's it. It's simple. How much truth is in the way my brain thinks about more dense carby stuff, like a soft pretzel or pizza or something like that, in that it sits in my stomach and it breaks down slower so that it has more opportunity so my blood sugar is being impacted over a longer period of time, sometimes past when the impact of my bolus is there. Do I think about that correctly, or is that just the cartoon way that works for me?
No, it's a great way to kind of think about it and also plan to bolus for it. And some of that also takes experience, right? It takes experience seeing, well, gosh, whenever I eat this soft pretzel, it's all carb. And unless you're dipping it in the cheese sauce or something high fat that kind of comes along with it, the vat of butter, if you're just eating the soft pretzel, it's all carb. But the dense nature of it may be what requires a little bit more drawn out, because you don't necessarily need that quick impact all up front. You may need some, but then you're going to need it for a little bit longer in the aftermath.
Yeah.
The same is true for some of those more whole grain, hearty types of starchy foods, things like wild rice or quinoa or, those kinds of things. They've got a better fiber complex to them. They've not been processed. They're going to break down slower, and they're going to have a lower glycemic impact. So you may need to draw out the bolus a little bit in order to prevent having a low before it kind of impacts or hits you later.
Right. You have to stop thinking about the food goes in and my blood sugar tries to go up right away. So I'll get, that's why your timing's messed up. You have to understand a little bit how the food makes its way through your system. High carb, low carb, high fat, low fat, and in between I used to tell people try to imagine an overlay machine, but then that got an old idea, when you're in school and they do the somebody would write on a piece of plastic and they'd shine it up on the board, right?
Yep.
And I used to say, take 2 pieces of plastic instead and make one like a line of the impact of where your insulin's hitting and one a line of where the food's hitting. The goal is you have to slide those pieces of plastic left and right
and make them meet
till they match up. Yeah. Yeah, you absolutely can't. You can't just throw in all the insulin now and just hope it hits, because you hear people say all the time, like, oh, I bolused and I got low and then I got high later. None of this makes sense. Diabetes. And I'm like, no, you're so close. It's interesting. Jenny, earlier you said that I look at a plate and I just know from experience and everything. I also think I just know. I don't know why I know. And that's important to understand. Like, I can't quantify it for you sometimes. I can just look at a plate and go, that's this much insulin. I know it. And it is obviously from something. But at the same time, I have privately, for the one person who called me an egomaniac in a recent review, this is not me being egotistical. I'm just telling a story. But I fixed 2 kids' basal rates this week remotely. And they sent me a graph. And as soon as I looked at the graph, I thought, oh, I know what's wrong with this. But I couldn't explain it to you. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I couldn't write a manual about why this graph points to what it points to. But I knew as soon as I saw it. And I think everybody can get to that, because I know who I am. I know what I got in school for grades. I can't possibly be that smart, right? So seriously, like, I think time just teaches. And please,
it does.
This is not an invitation for everybody to send me their thing. But I am, by the way, it did make me think, Jenny, I think there's got to be a way to start a service where you take people's graphs and make basal recommendations back from the graphs. Because once you get people moving in the right direction with their basal, they start to see it, and then they can dial it in on their own. Then they don't need you. This lovely person's texting me, you have to let me send you something because I'm going to be bugging you for the rest of my life. And I laughed and I said, A, you can't send me anything. And I don't, please, I don't want anything. But B, you're not going to need me for like ever. Like 3 days from now, this is going to just make all the kind of sense in the world to you. It just you start to see it, you know?
When you have diabetes and use insulin, low blood sugar can happen when you don't expect it. Gvoke HypoPen is a ready-to-use glucagon option that can treat very low blood sugar in adults and kids with diabetes, ages 2 and above. Find out more. Go to gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk.
Right.
I wish The Matrix wasn't a 20-year-old movie, because it's such a great reference, but things start to slow down, you know?
They do. And they start to come together in a way like Neo, sort of all of a sudden, all of those images that are flooding the screen in The Matrix. Like you said, that's a great movie to bring up in context here, because it comes together and his brain is like, I can see it all. Yeah. It's clear. And I mean, life with diabetes changes, variables come up, and there are always going to be new avenues to explore and figure out. But the intuition of the day-to-day management, the intuition gets easier. And I think that's what you manage off of, a lot of really good built-in intuition of it's this feeling. And you can't often, I think other people would agree, you can't often put that down in writing. You can't say, I know how this is wrong. I can't tell you why, but I know this is how to fix it. Yeah. I know this needs to be adjusted here, or you need something else here, or whatever. Now, some of it can be, some of that intuition can be simplified if you do some, we're talking all about like food and the impact, carbs and fats and proteins. And some of that, if I've gotten a little bit into the science of why there's impact there from these foods that we don't really ever talk about. Fats and proteins are kind of like swept under the table when diabetes education comes up. It's usually all carbs, right? We focus on carbs. We learn how to carb count. And I mean, the basics of carb counting are pretty easy with a label. You look at the label for the serving size, you look down the label for the total carb amount. Next down, you might look at fiber. If there's enough of it, you might deduct a little bit of it. But that's what we're taught. And then you're given this little ratio that's like, oh, for every 10 grams that you count from a label, you need this much insulin to take with it, right? So it's a very mathematical figure. But if we take it sort of one step farther than that very simple carb counting, as you mentioned before, not all carbs are created equal. Right. You could have 10 grams of counted, celery versus 10 grams of counted watermelon. There's going to be a different impact blood sugar wise from those carbs, even though the carb count is exactly the same.
Yes.
And so that it kind of brings in, can you be precise in carb counting? To a degree. You can look at labels, you can measure, you can use weighted scales and all of that kind of thing. You can get precise. But from the standpoint of then understanding why blood sugar did this versus did this, upswing, stable, flat, drop down, that actually, it takes it a step further into glycemic index and the nature of that food. And glycemic index also, it encompasses the components of a meal too, not just the carb at the meal, but like I said before with the pizza, you could have just the flat old pizza crust and bolus for that with just all the carb that's there. Your aftermath blood sugar is going to look very different than when you eat it as like a meat lover or an all over cheese pizza. There are different components there impacting how those carbs are going to change your blood sugar.
And when those variables are invisible to you, it causes you to say, oh, that's just diabetes. I can't do anything about that. That's just diabetes. Right. But there is, like I've been saying forever, Jenny's just put it into specific words, which is beautiful. But I've been saying forever, if your blood sugar is getting really high or really low, you're not using the insulin correctly. I know that doesn't help you figure out how to use the insulin, but it should help you to know that there's still an answer. And just because you don't see it in the moment doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It would be no different than if I sat down and looked at multivariable calculus. And then I said to you, there's no answer to this. Well, a person who understands multivariable calculus would say, of course there is. You just don't understand calculus. And so the trick is with diabetes, how do you find the ideas that help you get through this stuff without everything turning into a calculus problem, right? Like, how does it just become day-to-day super simple and easy? And the reason you need to listen to Jenny is not only because she, teaches this stuff at Integrated Diabetes, not just because she's been living with type 1 diabetes for a very long time, not just because she's a CDE or a nutritionist, blah, 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 all that stuff, but she lives in a part of the country where food literally tries to kill people. So,
thanks.
Yeah, I mean, wow. My brother and Jenny live reasonably near each other, and the things my brother describes as food when he got there, I was like, Brian, that's not food. Don't eat that. And I was like,
I would have to say Madison is sort of a little bit of an island in the state of Wisconsin. So Madison is a little different. We're a little beyond what the typical Wisconsinite. But yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying, if you're rolling into a moment with bratwurst on a roll with a beer, with some popcorn soaked in caramel, and cheese curds deep fried, like you need to know what you're doing,
Right, absolutely. And that's where understanding and learning things like, hey, fat and protein and all of these factors, they can have an impact for you. It's not all cut and dry, count the carbs, take the insulin, and you've got it made. Right. It's not. And I hate saying that because it sounds like, well, gosh, I'm never going to get a handle on this if I have to start being a mathematician and, figuring it all.
Right. But you will if you think beyond what you were told. So somebody tells you, like Jenny said, flip the box over, a half a cup of this is 10 carbs. You get a unit for every 10 carbs. So that's a unit like that. But then once that doesn't work, you guys have heard me say it a million times, it's insane to go back the next day, recount the same 10 carbs and go, okay, unit, because that's what the doctor told me. No. I used a unit. My blood sugar went up. It took me 3/4 of a unit to correct it. Next time, let's try a unit and a half or a unit, and, try more, because it took more, to
correct.
You just have to you have to be able to walk past it. Yeah, you have to. I'm telling you, for the people that I speak to over and over and over again, there's a moment where you just have to trust your gut. Like, you have to trust that what you're seeing is actually happening, which is why I made one of the tenets of the podcast, Trust that what you know is going to happen is going to happen. And that's simple. Like, it's not, I say all the time, like, it's not stacking if you need it. And I got a private message the other day that said that sentence unlocked my world. Just, changed my life. And I thought, I'm glad I randomly said it because I didn't think of it ahead of time. You guys have been listening for a long time. You realize there's no notes in front of me. I've planned none of this. As a matter of fact, Jenny and I start recording and I go, hey, we're going to do like the fat and protein today. Okay. And she goes, okay. It's about unlocking your mind from what, the confines that you were giving at diagnosis. And it's energizing to see it happen to people early in their diagnosis, because then they're not going to live their whole life like this. But it's rewarding to see someone who's lived with diabetes for a long time have like the light turn back on for them.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Some of the messages you guys send are, you guys owe me tissues. You know what I mean?
Aww.
So it's really something. Okay, so all right, we did carb counting basics. I like flip the box over, take a look, go by weight.
The box over. Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to go beyond the carb counting basics and get more into a little bit, I mean, taking it beyond would really be looking at the glycemic index, but then one beyond would be glycemic load. Do you know what that is, Scott?
No, those are going to be defining diabetes things we're going to do after we stop recording this, Jenny.
Okay. Awesome.
All right, we're good. We did well with this, I think.
Yeah.
I want to thank Ascensia Diabetes for sponsoring the Remastered Diabetes Pro Tip series. Don't forget, you can get a free Contour Next Gen Starter Kit at contournext.com/juicebox free meter. While supplies last, U.S. residents only. If you're enjoying the remastered episodes of the Diabetes Pro Tip series from the Juicebox Podcast, you have Touched by Type 1 to thank. Touchedbytype1.org is a proud sponsor of the remastering of the Diabetes Pro Tip series. Learn more about them at touchedbytype1.org. A huge thank you to one of today's sponsors, Gvoke Glucagon. Find out more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. You spell that GVOKEGLUCAGON.com/juicebox. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Now, listen, there's 26 episodes in this series. You might not know what each of them are. I'm going to tell you now. Episode 1000 is called Newly Diagnosed or Starting Over. Episode 1001, all about MDI. 1002, all about insulin. 1003 is called Pre-Bolus. Episode 1004, Temp Basal. 1005, Insulin Pumping. 1006, Mastering a CGM. 1007, Bump and Nudge. 1008, The Perfect Bolus. 1009, Variables. 1010, Setting Basal Insulin. 1011, Exercise. 1012, Fat and Protein. 1013, Insulin Injury and Surgery. 1014, Glucagon and Low BGs. In episode 1015, Jenny and I talk about emergency room protocols. In 1016, long-term health. 1017, Bump and Nudge Part 2. In episode 1018, pregnancy. 1019, explaining type 1. 1020, glycemic index and load. 1021, postpartum. 1022, weight loss. 1023, honeymoon. 1024, female hormones. And in episode 1025, we talk about transitioning from MDI to pumping. Before I go, I'd like to share 2 reviews with you of the Diabetes Pro Tip series, one from an adult and one from a caregiver. I learned so much from the Pro Tip series when our son was diagnosed last summer. It really helped get me through those first few very tough weeks. It wasn't just your explanations of how it all works, which were way better than anything our diabetes educator told us, but something about the way you and Jenny presented everything, even the scary stuff, that reassured me that we could figure out how to deal with this and to teach our son how to deal with it too. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with us. This podcast is a game changer. 25 years as a type 1 diabetic, and only now am I learning some of the basics. Scott brings useful information and presents it in digestible ways. Learning that pre-bolus doesn't just mean bolus before you eat, but means timing your insulin so that it is active as the carbs become active, took me already from a decent 6.5 A1C down to a 5.6 in the past 8 months. I've never met Scott, but after listening to hundreds of episodes and joining him in his Facebook group, I consider him a friend. Listening to this podcast and applying it has been the best thing I have done for my health since diagnosis. I genuinely hope that the Diabetes Pro Tip series is valuable for you and your family. If it is, find me in the private Facebook group and say hello. If you're enjoying the Juicebox Podcast, please share it with a friend, a neighbor, your physician, or someone else who you know that might also benefit from the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Juicebox Podcast. Jenny Smith holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. She's also had type 1 diabetes for over 35 years, and she works at integrateddiabetes.com. If you're interested in hiring Jenny, you can learn more about her at that link.